Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Humane Podcast, your tech insider podcast on the data economy. From the physical circuit chips on your smartphone to the software powering GPT models, we live in a data-first world. Humane interviews the founders, investors, executives, and tech leaders that are creating the world that we live in for consumers and enterprises. Hello, listeners, and welcome back. Introducing Humane, the tech insider podcast on the data economy. From the physical circuit chips on your smartphone to the software powering GPT models, we live in a data-driven world. Humane interviews the founders, investors, executives, and leaders that are creating the world that we live in for consumers and enterprise. On this week's recording, we're bringing to you Protik Mukhopadhyay. Protik is the COO of Protecto.ai, which is a startup that's building in the very exciting and fast-moving pace of RAG. But before we dive into what is the startup and all their growth and velocity, I'd like to welcome Protik. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Hey, thank you for having me here. Appreciate it, David.
Yeah, very exciting. And of course, you and your company are building at a fantastic intersection of cutting edge technology. But before we get into all the things that you're doing, I'd love to share with our listeners a little bit about yourself. Maybe tell us a little bit about your journey that has led you up to building your current startup.
Absolutely. 18 years ago, came to this country as an immigrant student. I went to USC, graduated at a very interesting time, middle of recession in 2008. Was lucky enough to get an opportunity to work for a publicly listed tech company, develop some applications, and then from there started my own startup in 2016. We had a successful exit in 2021. Spent most of my professional career in California and then moved to Dallas. And I was trying to figure out what to do next, and then connected with the team at Protecto and figured out that solving financial services, healthcare challenges for companies adopting Gen AI will be a good problem to solve. So we teamed up last year and have been building Protecto. So yeah, consider myself very lucky that I get so many opportunities and I've been able to spend a lot of time in the Bay Area and now part of the Texas ecosystem. So see how it goes. But that's been my journey so far.
That's fantastic. And you and I originally met actually in Dallas when we were covering some trends in AI at the Dallas AI Society. Of
Right.
course, that was earlier this year, and it's been a non-stop, fast-paced year in all things AI, especially in what your company's building in the space of RAG. So maybe to start off our listeners, could you share with our listeners a little bit about the startup, about Protecto AI, and explain like what is retrieval augmented generation and why it's increasingly becoming significant for IT and business environments?
Absolutely, David. So if you look back, there have been a lot of patterns on how to develop applications. So when we were developing web applications, the common pattern was called MVC, Model View Controller. As companies adopt generative AI and they want to include their own proprietary information, their own knowledge base in their OpenAI integration or anything they're doing, the common pattern that is emerging is called RAG or Retrieval-Augmented Generation. That while I can generate a lot of content similar to our end user experience in using ChatGPT, how can I augment it at the time of retrieval with my own knowledge base? And that's the common pattern people are using. It's called RAG. It's essentially a application development pattern, you can call it, for generative AI applications that allows companies to bring their knowledge base, their proprietary data, all the IP they have developed, marry that with generative AI, and allow their customers, employees, partners to be more productive. And essentially, the promise of Gen AI for enterprises becomes easier to realize with RAG. That's kind of what RAG is. And you asked about Protecto. So there are ways to build RAG based on your preferred platform, whether it is Microsoft, Google. or Amazon. There are a lot of platforms already in place. But what Protecto does is it allows you to build for very specific sensitive data use cases. As I mentioned, that RAG as a pattern allows you to bring different information into your generative AI applications. But if you are a healthcare or financial services company, that's what we focus is allowing them to use sensitive data in their RAG pipeline, making sure anything that is sensitive, confidential, is part of some regulation like HIPAA. We follow the right legacy protocols, as I call it, like GDPR or CCPA, or even newer protocols that have been come through the EU Act and the NIST AI Act, right? So we allow companies to follow those best practices and bring data in their RAG pipeline. And that's kind of the mission for Protecto.
It's so important. And I think you and I've seen such an evolution in the data and AI systems the last few years. Of course, with RAG being one of the newest evolutions. You've just shared here a little bit about the need for it, but to add, Protik, so your company Protecto, it offers a secure RAG solution. Could you walk us through some of the key technical or architectural patterns in RAG AI systems and how they address security concerns?
So I'll talk about RAG in general, and Protector essentially think of it like is one of the guardrails. But there are a lot of complex strategies when it comes to building a RAG, including a chunking strategy, the choice of the vector database. But think about RAG in four dimensions: data, latency, throughput, and accuracy. So when I say data, where Protector focuses is data privacy, where we are able to handle sensitive data. We also essentially focus a little bit on bias and fairness, because what we do is we replace anything sensitive with a synthetic version. So that way your systems essentially are not having the actual data, but having the metadata about it. But the other challenges that happen with RAG that you should also think about is the retrieval time. So latency is one of the things we always focus on, so that the whenever you're retrieving relevant documents from a data store, there is a certain response time that you need to look at. Throughput is one of the biggest concerns with CPUs and GPUs costing a lot. We are seeing a lot of focus on infrastructure cost coming in. And obviously, the most important among all this is you can protect your data, you can have really good throughput, you can have really good retrieval time. But is your response that is coming from your RAG system really relevant? Is it based on your current corporate policy? If you have developed a RAG, let's say for your employee policies, is it referring to the latest policy that was enforced and approved recently, right? So the relevance of your retrieval, I would say, and how accurate it is really important. And I think that essentially allows companies to also trust AI, improve the adoption, and allow clients and end users to look at AI as something that can make them more productive. Everything else becomes irrelevant if your response or the relevance is not there, right? So we always think about in these four dimensions: sensitive data, data latency, throughput, and accuracy when it comes to RAG.
And now, thinking through those requirements, I imagine organizations might face challenges when implementing RAG systems. And perhaps it's some of the ones you mentioned. It could be dealing with sensitivity, latency, throughput, accuracy costs. Can you tell us more about these challenges that they might be facing?
So in our experience, and we have done some very complex deployments, I think it starts with your data quality and consistency. Even pre-Gen AI, a lot of the challenges with AI was how do I maintain high quality data? Can I have consistent data across my data sources? So data quality, I think, is still one of the biggest challenges as well as an opportunity when it comes to the full realization and the value of RAG through Gen AI. The other thing that happens is we're seeing a lot of times people being very successful in POCs, but essentially post production, a lot of the projects essentially lose steam or they get canceled. So you have to look at edge cases, you have to look at scenarios. So the business value that you're trying to realize through some of these RAG applications should also have edge cases, because hallucination, some people say, especially in Gen AI, is a feature, not a bug. So how do you ensure that as you are bringing your corporate data in your RAG pipeline, you are focused on handling those edge use cases? There are a lot of data observability tools that measure model drift. So monitoring and managing a model drift that you're going to be using as part of your RAG pipeline is important. And then the first and the last and most important thing is operational cost. For every project, there is an ROI we have seen, but a lot of times the ongoing costs related to the infrastructure and the storage and the compute can go out of proportion. So sizing your environment, figuring out what kind of rack pipeline you have to use, understanding the nuances of your APIs. You don't have to always use synchronous APIs. You can use bulk or queues. I think those things actually go a long way in ensuring that your projects are successful and avoid some of the issues that we have seen.
And of course, it's as you mentioned, talking about these issues. There's probably some specific use cases where RAG's been highly effective. Of course, it's still an emerging technology, but are there areas you've seen, like in customer support or legal compliance, with those strong use cases?
Absolutely. Let me start with creative writing. All of us are probably using in our personal life using ChatGPT, but rack systems can be really powerful for creating, especially if you work in the marketing department, custom themes, genre specific topics, essentially allowing your marketing teams or social media teams to amplify the brand that you want to talk about, whether it's a B2B or a B2C company. So that is a very interesting use case where you can take all your prior IP, all your prior content, maybe your new brand positioning, and leverage that inside of a rack pipeline to build a lot of new content much faster, much more accurate, that follows your brand guidelines. So that is one very interesting use case we are seeing. Contract drafting for legal has become a very common use case. Paralegals are now becoming way more productive because you would have your corporate clauses inside of your repositories, but you would have legal precedents maybe in different repositories. So how can a paralegal create very good responses, draft contract language, respond to legal letters by leveraging their own corporate information and marry that with some of the newer legislation that is happening, right? So contract drafting is becoming very popular. And then the last thing you mentioned about help desk, right? So imagine a very large company that has thousands of technical support, a Cisco or a Microsoft, or even a healthcare company, right? How can I make the agent more productive? They will have access to their CRM system, they'll have access to retrieving knowledge base, product articles. But can I contextualize that and convert a user query to a prompt and allow them to have a lot more productive experience? Can I reduce the tickets meaningfully? I think there are a lot of documented use cases, especially I would say the biggest winner I've seen so far for RAG instead of enterprises is help desk. And I feel that can actually also help you to do product innovation. A lot of the information that come in through cases eventually becomes a way for product teams to also prioritize their roadmap. So hopefully a lot of interesting innovations across support, creative writing, and legal contract creation that is all getting enabled through RAG systems that have developed in these enterprises.
100%. And, thinking about all these solutions, one of our favorite topics on Humane is about ethics and responsible AI. And your company emphasizes the importance of trustworthy AI. And so, with that in mind, Protik, what are some key principles that organizations should follow to ensure their AI systems are ethical and responsible?
I think the way I have to approach this is, why should it be limited just to AI systems? I think in general, you should always look at ethics, privacy, security as a design first approach. So whenever you're designing any applications, I think these are very critical. The reason why ethics in general becomes a challenge with AI is because the data that you have may be biased in general because it doesn't have all the data sets, right? So you have to look at the applications that you're developing and figure out that I'm going to use these rack systems that I'm developing as one of the data points. But end of the day, think about the response that is coming from your GenAI systems as a recommendation. You should not ever use that as your final authority. The decision of what action to take, how to ethically conduct yourself should still be with end stakeholders. And if you treat rack systems as decision systems or recommendation systems, I think it's all fine. I think the challenge, what happens is no matter, even if disclaimers are put in or people talk about that you have to use your own judgment, people miss that out. I think it's very important to educate people that AI systems work on the data it is trained on. And if the data inherently doesn't have all the data sets, there's a very good chance that it may be biased or it may have certain limitations. And based on your company policies, your personal code of conduct, and even with your local regulations based on which country you stay, which state you stay in the US, I think you have to use your best judgment to take action. Action and recommendations are two different things. And I think a lot of times when people mix the two, confusion happens. That's how I would sort of look at ethics in general.
And applying all these thoughts around ethics, I suppose that Protecto's solution helps companies. It helps them with compliance on data protection regulations, especially when you're thinking about sensitive information like healthcare data. Would you share more or unpack that for our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Responsible AI is a very broad umbrella. And the way we classify ourselves is we enable responsible AI. But in order to enable responsible AI, you need a lot of other attributes. Where Protecto comes in is we help you find what is sensitive in your data sets. It could be PII, PHI. We then mask it with synthetic data. The reason we mask with synthetic data is because we don't want the data to lose context. So when you're training it for LLMs, it is still thinking about a name and a phone number. And then eventually we focus on the quality of the retrieval. Data masking technologies have existed for the last 20 years. So why now? Why Protecto? The reason is, while detection of sensitive data is not difficult, what or where Protecto is a little different is after we do the detection, we also maintain referential integrity of that data. What I mean by that is if I have the word David 10 times in my support ticket, I'm going to use the same token. I'm not going to use inconsistent tokens. Even if I mask it with different tokens, while I am following the privacy compliance laws, I am going to make the LLM super confused because I may use different tokens, right? So we use consistent tokens. Second, what we do is we replace it with synthetic data versus any random text so that the format is preserved and the LLM, if it's expecting a name, it gets a name. If it's expecting a phone number, it'll get a 10-digit phone number. And the third important thing is we put it in a very secure vault and we maintain a relationship between your synthetic version and the actual version. So the LLM or the RAG pipeline never gets what is sensitive, but based on your access level and how you define your roles, you're still able to retrieve the original data as well as synthetic data, right? So you have the ability essentially to do very granular applications. Your HR system may want to say, hey, for me, emails are not sensitive. I don't want to mask it. But your support team will say, no, any client email also I want to mask it. A lot of business rules can vary from department to department. We enable that. A lot of times you will see use cases like I want to mask my patient name, but I don't want to mask the doctor's name. For an AI system, a name is a name, right? But then we have some unique ways where you can have some attribute based masking, right? So that's how we essentially allow the consumption of sensitive data inside of your RAG pipeline, and specifically healthcare payers, providers, financial service companies. When you're applying for a loan, David, you have to give so much data, right? Pay stubs, SSN, all that data instead of a human underwriter, maybe it first goes to a AI underwriter and then it goes to a human, right? You don't want the AI underwriter to get what is sensitive. So we allow you to mask what is sensitive, right? So that's kind of where Protecto helps in responsible AI.
It's so great to hear the mission and how the focus is very much thinking about organizations first, starting with data security. And I imagine that working with a lot of clients, working with design partners, perhaps you have some lessons learned in developing these robust RAG AI systems in production and deployment. If you could share with us what are some of those lessons learned, or what are some of those hurdles in moving from proof of concept to these full scale implementations?
Sure, David. I think it goes back to a little bit about what I was talking about. So I'll kind of summarize that, right? Data quality, handling edge cases, and then operational costs. I think those are very important dimensions to look at. But I think what has happened is in the euphoria of generative AI for the last 1 year, what we are seeing today is a lot of POCs are getting abandoned. They are getting abandoned because of three reasons. And I would recommend anyone now trying to build their Gen AI applications using the RAG pattern or some Copilot type of pattern is see the business value that has been promised by Gen AI cannot be just realized simply by enabling Copilot. You have to look at the adoption plan. So if you don't develop an adoption plan of how you're going to roll out and educate and allow your end users to be successful, I think that is a recipe for disaster. For example, the contracts use case I mentioned, paralegals should think of this as a productivity tool, not as a replacement tool for them. If they do that, then they will not be open to sharing that. So I think the messaging and branding of these tools internally is very important. And I think that allows people to see it from a business value lens and work backwards on your adoption plan. So I think that is a very key important lessons learned for us. Apart from what I mentioned, right? Like if you don't have data quality, don't take up these projects. Make sure you have a consistent data quality in place, and there are a lot of tools that can improve your data quality. Fix that problem first before you start your AI projects. There are a lot of very important tools. I saw something from Databricks recently where they have enabled system tables. There are also third-party tools, but ongoing operational cost, getting down to even a cost per query or cost per prompt, I think will enable you to also message this correctly. So you understand that if suddenly there's a spike, your CIO doesn't shut down your projects because you never anticipated the consumption in this way, right? So that is very important. And finally, CISO's privacy, a lot of your teams that are focused on regulation internally, they have to report certain metrics to their board. So make sure that you do a CISO review early in your project. Make sure that from a privacy, security, and governance perspective, if CISO has given a go ahead, or if they've called out the risk, you handle those as part of your implementation, right? I think those are some of the things that I would recommend.
Beautiful. Well, it's great to take these recommendations. So, if you're an enterprise executive or developer listening into the show, these are some great recommendations as you're thinking about building and scaling your RAG AI solutions and partnering with a product like Protecto. And switching gears, right, to your product offering, Protector offers both on premise and SaaS options. If you could share with our audience, how do you help companies decide which deployment model is best for their needs, especially when dealing perhaps with sensitive data?
So David, in all openness, 90% of all our production deployments are actually on-prem. The way we are seeing, and this is just because we focus on US-based financial services and healthcare clients, which are pretty regulated, they would prefer a Protecto-like tool that promises data protection, governance, and AI guardrails deployed behind their firewall in their VPC. So we typically give them a container, and that's how they do it. When it comes to a SaaS offering, most of the time the SaaS offering is a way for us to solve a small use case or a POC. So if you want to sign up for Protecto, you can sign up for a trial today on our website. You can look at how accurate our detection algorithm is, how we are doing the sensitive data management. And then eventually, for smaller use cases, I think a SaaS application is a fairly good alternate. But for vast majority of our clients, including the recent client that I was telling you last time, David, where we are deployed across the 3,000 client customers, is essentially behind their firewall in their VPC as a container. So they have the flexibility to monitor it based on their data volumes, add more CPU power, and then also have the flexibility to apply some application level security on top of it, right? So that's kind of what we see, almost a 80-20 split between on-prem and SaaS. And when we say on-prem, essentially what I mean is it's still on the cloud, but it's essentially in the client's environment in their VPC behind their firewall, which is typically AWS, GCP, or Azure, whatever is the client's preferred cloud partner.
Awesome. And I know you've covered a lot of different security elements, and you may have alluded to or shared this earlier. But in addition, your solution at Protecto incorporates RBAC or role based access control into the RAG process. Would you share more with our listeners or explain how this enhances security and privacy in AI applications?
Yeah, sure. So typically what happens is RBAC is something you define at the organization level. So Protector doesn't define RBAC. What we do is we inherit RBAC in our APIs. So a very classic example, I think it's good to give you an example. So for example, let's say your HR has rolled out a chat GPT like application for HR policies, and you are a resident of Singapore and you just type is Monday and holiday. Now, this is a global company. They have employees in US, Europe, India, Singapore. What we would do is, even though he asked, is Monday a holiday, we would look at a lot of the attributes that they have in their roles and look at your RBAC application and say that, okay, the actual prompt is as a resident of Singapore, who is a full-time employee in this company, based on the Singapore corporate policy, which is existing in the Singapore folder, can you retrieve the right information and get back to me? So what we do is we essentially inherit the role that an employee has, tie it up in our system, and make sure that when we are retrieving any information, the same information that we are retrieving is based on their role. It's almost like, just like you have role-based access, think about through Protecto, you get response-based access. So based on your role, you will get the response coming from your rack systems. That's kind of how our system works. So the right data that is going to be retrieved against your role will be very relevant for you. You will not be retrieving the employee corporate policy that belongs to somebody who is in the US, right? There's no harm in it, but it creates confusion. But now you can think about use cases. What if there was some sensitive data? Maybe instead of an HR policy, we are dealing with a finance controller, and now he's talking about some data that is forecasted. So there are a lot of ways we limit access, and we only show what is relevant based on the RBAC that has been defined, but we inherit in our system to ensure that it's consistent.
Awesome. Well, we always love consistent software, right? Which is ensuring we're meeting and exceeding all those requirements needed. And there's so much change occurring. It's very fast-paced industry. Looking ahead, Protech, what developments or trends do you foresee in the field of secure and privacy-focused AI, particularly for enterprise applications? Maybe keep it like a short time horizon, 1 to 3 years out. Kind of what are you seeing on the radar?
It's a very difficult question because 1 to 3 years, maybe in the software could be 10 to 30 years with the pace of innovation. But today, where I see a lot of challenges and where there is a great scope of improvement is relevance and the focus on explainability. So what I mean by that is I think the rack systems will be really mature in the next 3 to 6 months. And there are a lot of different ways, right? Like people are using a graph and a rack together, or you're using a rack pipeline, or you're using a combination of different ways to retrieve the information. So accuracy is one dimension, but the relevance of that accuracy, measuring of that, how do you do the ranking? Based on the ranking, how can you continuously serve the right documents? How do you allow the systems not go stale? I think those are interesting problems. Perhaps probably will be solved not in 3 years, but maybe more like 6 to 9 months. But I think most of the time today, the retrieval piece and the generation piece is fairly easy to solve. And as LLMs become a commodity and people have options between open source tools like Llama 3 to ChatGPT, I think the quality of the response will be good, but we just want to make sure that the relevance over time is retained. And how can you ensure that you have a metric or a measurement, almost like giving a relevant score that is very specific when you retrieve information? I think that will give some confidence to people. And if you add that with explainability and allow people to get more insights of why the response is coming this way, I think that will go a long way. And I've seen some demos of tools already doing that, but I think that becoming mainstream and that becoming almost like a mandatory requirement, I think will really help people adopt and trust AI.
Well, I, for one, am really excited for the technology that you and your company are building and all the evolution we're seeing in the RAG space. It's such an emerging field and very excited, Protik, to have you on the show today as the COO of Protecto.ai. Protik Mukhopadhyay, thanks so much for sharing with us and the listeners at Humane about all that you do.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate the time. Along with Protecto, we also have a community called AI Ignite Studio where we connect product companies and founders. And if anyone is interested, especially if you are a data practitioner, chief data officers, want to connect with innovative companies, love to share more insights. It's a non-profit, free for any practitioner to join, and I'm very happy that I'm getting to build that and protect at the same time.
Beautiful. I always love causes for the community and paying it forward with a nonprofit cause. So awesome. Look forward to us all checking it out. And fantastic having you on the show today, Protik.
Take care, David. Really appreciate the time. Have a good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Humane Podcast. Did the episode measure up to your thoughts on ML and AI, data science, developer tools, and technical education? Share your thoughts with me at humanepodcast.com/contact. Remember to share this episode with a friend, subscribe and leave a review, and listen for more episodes of Humane.